to U.S. President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs. While countries like Canada say they're working to negotiate better trade deals with the U.S. president, Trump is doubling down on the use of tariffs as a way to boost the U.S. economy.
You know, Prime Minister Carney is trying his best, but this guy will say something one day, and he'll wake up, and the cheese slips off the cracker, and then all of a sudden he goes the other way. And you're thinking, how do you deal with a guy like this?
In recent months, the trade relationship between the United States and Canada has been marked by sharp tensions, largely fueled by the economic decisions of U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump's administration has used tariffs as a key tool to reshape international trade, positioning the United States as the dominant force in its dealings with other countries. Canada, a key ally of the U.S., has found itself in the crosshairs of this strategy. At the heart of this trade dispute is a seemingly inconsequential yet highly symbolic issue: Canada's position on Palestinian statehood. President Trump, ever the negotiator, believed he could leverage this foreign policy disagreement to his advantage in trade talks. Just hours before a deadline for new tariffs, he took to social media, not in the form of a diplomatic statement or through a back-channel discussion, but with a blunt, public threat. He made it clear that Canada's stance on Palestine would hinder any chance of reaching a trade deal, suggesting that Ottawa's refusal to align with U.S. policy could freeze talks altogether. This kind of public ultimatum wasn't a typical diplomatic maneuver. It was Trump's signature, a direct shot across the bow aimed at Canada's sovereignty. But Canada, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, did not buckle. Carney's response was deliberate, cautious, and unyielding. While many expected Canada to fold under pressure, Carney made it clear that Canada's independence in foreign policy was not negotiable. Unlike other nations that had faced Trump's tariff threats, such as Mexico and the UK, Canada's response was not one of fear or capitulation. Instead, Canada doubled down, refusing to be bullied into submission. While Trump seemed to believe that Canada would be swayed by the pressure of economic threats, the Canadian government stood firm. Trump's early strategy was one of intimidation. He wielded tariffs like a blunt instrument, hoping to force concessions from Canada by presenting the U.S. as an economic powerhouse, capable of dictating terms to its neighbors. He accused Canada of imposing unfair tariffs on U.S. products, particularly on dairy, and claimed that Canadian farmers had been mistreating their American counterparts. But this rhetoric, while inflammatory, ignored the reality of the deeply integrated trade relationship between the two countries. Canada and the U.S. share one of the most interconnected economies in the world, and the idea that tariffs alone could upend this was naive at best. In a rare moment of transparency, Trump expressed his frustration directly, suggesting that Canada's refusal to bow to U.S. demands was a result of their supposed inability to understand the magnitude of U.S. power. To him, sovereignty was a commodity, something that could be bought and sold depending on the whims of political necessity. But Canada, under Carney's leadership, made it clear that sovereignty was not for sale. The key difference between the U.S. and Canada in this scenario was the approach to negotiation. Trump relied on fear, intimidation, and an aggressive form of diplomacy, hoping to coerce Canada into making concessions through sheer force. Canada, on the other hand, relied on long-term strategy and steady resolve. Carney understood that Canada's strength lay not in yielding to pressure, but in maintaining its own course and standing firm on principle. In the midst of these diplomatic tensions, a quiet shift was happening behind the scenes. While the U.S. president was waging his public battle, Canada was quietly preparing for the long haul. Carney's vision wasn't just about surviving the trade war. It was about strengthening Canada's economy and reducing its vulnerability to U.S. volatility. Rather than retaliate in kind, Carney focused on bolstering Canada's domestic industries and diversifying trade relationships. Investments in key sectors like steel, aluminum, and manufacturing were being made, ensuring that Canada's economic future wasn't tethered solely to the whims of the White House. This proactive approach sent a message: Canada could stand on its own 2 feet, regardless of what the U.S. did. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy, under the weight of Trump's tariffs, began to show signs of strain. Job growth in May and June of 2019 was abysmal. In fact, nearly 260,000 jobs were revised out of the official labor market numbers, and the monthly job growth barely reached 20,000, far below the 100,000 to 200,000 jobs typically expected in a healthy economy. Economists quickly pointed to the uncertainty surrounding the trade war as a key reason businesses were hesitant to hire, and the administration's aggressive rhetoric was directly contributing to this lack of confidence in the U.S. economy. Trump's response to this economic downturn was to blame statisticians, accusing them of rigging the data to undermine his presidency. However, the reality was clear. The president's trade war was taking a toll on the U.S. economy. While the U.S. grappled with economic turbulence, Canada was quietly strengthening its position. Thanks to an updated trade agreement, Canada had already secured exemptions from tariffs on nearly 90% of its exports to the United States. This exemption was the result of years of careful negotiation and had essentially neutralized Trump's main weapon in the trade war. Trump had been quick to threaten economic fire, but Canada was already fireproof. Despite the increasing pressure from the U.S., Canada's economy remained relatively stable. While other countries like Europe and Japan faced new blanket tariffs, Canada's trade protections held firm, shielding much of its trade from the volatility of Trump's economic policies. Carney's careful negotiation ensured that Canada's exports to the U.S. were well protected, making it difficult for Trump's threats to have any significant impact. As the trade standoff wore on, it became clear that Trump's strategy of relentless pressure had begun to backfire. His tactics, built on the expectation that Canada would tire and concede, had not worked. Carney's steady hand had turned the tables. Instead of Canada being weakened by the constant threats, it had become stronger and more independent. And the more Trump's aggressive rhetoric failed to yield results, the more it became clear that the U.S. president had miscalculated the true nature of his power. Canada, by standing firm and refusing to be swayed by threats, had not only protected its economic interests, but had also reinforced a message that would resonate globally. Sovereignty and independence were non-negotiable, no matter how powerful the neighbor to the south might be. Canadian exports protected from tariffs, the U.S. had very little leverage left in this battle. Trump's attempts to bully Canada into submission had backfired, and the tables had turned. Canada had emerged from the confrontation not only with its sovereignty intact, but with a stronger, more diversified economy that was less dependent on the whims of the U.S. government. As the U.S. Canada trade standoff continued, the broader implications of Trump's economic policies began to unfold. The rift between the two countries was not just a bilateral issue. It was becoming a case study in the long-term consequences of economic isolationism and the importance of maintaining global partnerships. While Trump's administration believed it could use tariffs and aggressive diplomacy to reshape the global economic landscape, the reality was that such tactics were creating ripples that were affecting not just the U.S. and Canada, but the global economy as a whole. One of the key challenges with Trump's approach was the broader perception of the United States on the world stage. For decades, the U.S. had been seen as a leader in global trade, forging agreements and alliances with countries around the world. But Trump's America First policy, which emphasized protectionism and unilateralism, was eroding the trust and cooperation that had once defined U.S. foreign policy. By alienating traditional allies like Canada, the U.S. was diminishing its influence in key global forums and trade agreements. As the U.S. withdrew from multilateral trade agreements and sought to impose its will on smaller countries, Canada, under Prime Minister Carney's leadership, was doing the opposite. Canada's strategy was about forging new trade relationships, diversifying its economic ties, and strengthening its position in international trade. While Trump was focused on tearing down agreements that had been years in the making, Canada was quietly building new ones that would ensure its economic resilience, regardless of what happened to U.S. policies. This shift in strategy was not just about surviving the trade war. It was about positioning Canada as a stable, reliable partner in a rapidly changing global economy. Canada's willingness to stand up to U.S. pressure and maintain its independence had sent a strong message to the world. It would not sacrifice its sovereignty or economic stability for the sake of short-term deals or political appeasement. This stance, which many initially viewed as a gamble, was beginning to pay off as international businesses and governments recognized the strength and stability of Canada's economic framework. While Trump's aggressive trade war rhetoric was designed to push other countries into submission, Canada's resilience in the face of this pressure was reshaping the balance of power. Canada was not just a victim of Trump's trade war. It was becoming a leader in global trade policy, advocating for fair agreements and partnerships that protected its own interests while fostering long-term stability. This was evident not only in Canada's internal economic strategy, but also in its increasing role as a mediator in global trade disputes. In the face of increasing protectionism in the U.S., Canada's role as a stable trading partner was becoming more attractive. Other countries that had been hesitant to challenge U.S. policies or enter into trade agreements with Canada were now reconsidering their stance. Canada, with its stable political environment, strong economy, and commitment to fairness, was becoming a beacon of reliability in a world of uncertainty. The global economic landscape was shifting, and Canada was positioning itself as a key player in the evolving dynamics. While the U.S. was embroiled in a trade war that had damaged its own economy, Canada was moving forward with strategic agreements that would protect its industries and allow them to thrive. The shift was subtle but significant, with countries across the world recognizing the value of working with a partner that prioritized stability over short-term gains. But the question remained: how would this conflict ultimately affect U.S.-Canada relations in the long run? While the trade war had created tensions, it also revealed the strength of Canada's position and the vulnerability of the U.S. when its policies are driven by ego and short-term political goals rather than strategic foresight. The relationship between the two countries was undergoing a transformation, from one built on mutual trust and cooperation to one where Canada was increasingly asserting its own economic interests, independent of U.S. influence. Looking forward, Canada's path seemed clear. By investing in its own industries, diversifying its trade relationships, and standing firm on its principles, Canada was preparing for a future where it was less dependent on the U.S. and more capable of navigating the complexities of global trade. Prime Minister Carney's careful diplomacy and commitment to Canada's sovereignty had positioned the country for success, even in the face of a volatile neighbor. For the United States, the future was less certain. As Trump continued to escalate the trade war, the long-term economic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The trade war was not only harming America's global standing, but was also disrupting the domestic economy. The erosion of trust in the U.S. government, the weakening of key economic institutions, and the destabilizing effects of tariffs were all signs of a country in decline. Trump's focus on power and control had failed to deliver the economic growth he had promised, and the backlash was beginning to show in the form of job losses, reduced investment, and increasing political instability. The global reaction to Trump's policies was telling. Countries around the world were beginning to look for alternatives to the U.S. as a trading partner. In the wake of Trump's protectionist policies, Canada was becoming a more attractive option, not just for trade, but for investment, diplomacy, and international cooperation. While the U.S. was isolating itself, Canada was opening doors to new partnerships and alliances that would shape the future of global trade. As for Trump, his attempts to reshape the global economy through tariffs, public threats, and personal vendettas had failed. While he had succeeded in creating chaos and division,